Consider this. It is your wedding day. You are 12 years old. A stranger 3 times your age is about to become your husband. A man chosen by your father. A man you met only days ago. But that is not the worst part. Before dawn, your mother wakes you. Her hands are shaking as she holds something you have never seen before. A spear, not a ceremonial replica. A real weapon. One that, if the stories are true, has already pierced human flesh and taken a life in battle. She uses its blood-stained point to part your hair, strand by strand, while whispering the same thing her mother whispered to her on her wedding day. Tonight, do not resist. Within hours, you will be dragged screaming through the streets of Rome while a mob chants obscene verses about what is about to happen to your body. You will be carried over a threshold smeared with wolf fat and in a room filled with incense and shadows in front of a bed placed deliberately in the most public part of the house. A knot will be untied that can never be tied again. This is not fiction. This is not the plot of some horror film. This is what actually happened at Roman weddings. Not hidden in dungeons or whispered about in shame, but celebrated, ritualized, and performed in broad daylight for over 1,000 years. But this is not just a story about one girl, one wedding, one night. Over the next hour, I am going to dismantle an entire machine piece by piece and show you how it worked. Not from some dusty textbook, from the lives of real women whose names survived because men carved their stories in stone. Women like Turia, whose husband loved her so much, he wrote her the longest eulogy in Roman history. And then, after 30 years of marriage, after she saved his life, he offered to replace her. That story is coming. But first, you need to understand the machine she was fed into. And that machine needs us to address something you have probably heard before. Ius primi noctis, the right of the first night. You know the story. Evil feudal lords, tyrannical kings, the supposed right to bed a vassal's new bride before her own husband could touch her. It has appeared in everything from Braveheart to medieval horror stories painting a picture of ultimate sexual exploitation hidden behind walls of power. Here is the truth. When it comes to ancient Rome, that specific practice is almost certainly a myth. Modern historians have searched exhaustively for evidence of ius primi noctis in the Roman world. And what they have found is nothing. No laws, no credible contemporary accounts, no archaeological evidence. It appears to be a fabrication likely born from later medieval propaganda and humanity's endless fascination with painting the past as barbaric. So we can breathe a sigh of relief, right? The horror story was just that, a story. Wrong. Because while that particular nightmare may be fiction, what actually happened to Roman brides was arguably worse. Not worse because it was more violent, though it often was, but worse because it was not hidden. It was not a corruption of the system. It was the system. It was not an abuse of power happening in the shadows. It was power itself displayed proudly for all of Rome to witness and celebrate. The real horror of a Roman wedding night was not that the rules were being broken. It was that everyone was following them perfectly. The truth did not need a villain sneaking into bedrooms. The truth was the entire system operating exactly as designed in broad daylight, with everyone watching and applauding. And that system started not on a girl's wedding day, but the day she was born, the day her father decided whether she would live or die. Here's a detail that most history books skip past. When a baby was born in ancient Rome, the child was not automatically accepted into the family. The midwife would take the newborn, still wet, still screaming, and place it on the ground at the father's feet. Then the room went silent. Everyone watched the father. If he reached down and lifted the child into his arms, that child lived. It would be raised, named, fed, and eventually folded into the machinery of Roman society. But if the father turned away, if he simply walked out of the room without picking up that tiny body, the child was taken outside and left. Exposed, abandoned on a hillside at a crossroads beside a temple, left to die, or to be picked up by whoever happened to pass by, slave traders, strangers, no one. This practice was called exposure, and it was not rare. It was not scandalous. It was a father's legal right under Roman law, and it happened far more often to baby girls than to baby boys. We know this because the evidence survived. Archaeologists have found infant remains clustered at specific sites near Roman cities, and the overwhelming majority of those tiny skeletons belonged to girls. We know it because ordinary Romans wrote about it as casually as we might discuss a household budget. There is a letter, a real letter preserved on papyrus dating from the 1st century before the Common Era. A man named Hilarion wrote it to his pregnant wife Alice while he was away working. The letter is mostly mundane updates about money, a reminder to take care of the household. And then near the end this: if it is a boy, keep it. If it is a girl, expose it. That is a direct quote, not from a monster, not from a tyrant, from an ordinary working man writing a letter to his wife. He tells her he loves her in the same letter. He asks about his son, and he tells her to throw away their daughter like garbage. This was not cruelty by Roman standards. This was planning. The system that would one day drag a bride through the streets began right here at the father's feet. Because in Roman law, a father's power over his children was absolute. It had a name: patria potestas, paternal power. And it was not a metaphor. A Roman father legally owned his children the way he owned his cattle or his slaves. He decided whether they lived or died. He decided who they married. He decided whether they could own property. He controlled their money, their movements, and their futures. This power did not expire when a child grew up. A 50-year-old senator could technically still be under his father's patria potestas if his father was alive. For sons, this created tension. For daughters, it created a cage. Because while a son might eventually build his own career, fight in wars, enter politics, and gain practical independence, even under his father's legal shadow, a daughter had exactly one trajectory. She would be raised, trained, sealed, and delivered to a husband chosen by her father. She was not a person. She was an asset in the family portfolio, and her value was calculated with ruthless precision. Today, a father walks his daughter down the aisle. It feels like tradition, like love. But walk with me for the next hour, and you will see where that walk actually started. Somewhere around 80 BCE, in a wealthy Roman household, a baby girl was placed at her father's feet. He picked her up. He named her Turia. It was the luckiest moment of her life. Everything after that, the system handled. From the moment a Roman girl could walk, her training began. Not training in the way we might think of education. Roman girls of wealthy families might learn to read and write, might study Greek, might even develop sharp minds that their husbands would later praise in private letters. But the core curriculum, the skills that actually mattered, was something else entirely. Spinning, weaving, managing a household, silence, obedience, modesty. The Romans had a word for the supreme virtue of a woman: pudicitia. It meant sexual purity, modesty, and shame rolled into a single concept. A girl who had pudicitia was worth marrying. A girl who lacked it was worth nothing. Every Roman girl grew up knowing that her entire value, her worth as a human being in the eyes of her family and her society, rested on two things: her virginity before marriage and her ability to produce sons within it. Everything else, her intelligence, her courage, her capacity for love, those were bonuses. Nice to have, but ultimately irrelevant if the two core functions were not fulfilled. The system had a poster child. Her name was Cornelia, and she was the most celebrated mother in Roman history. Cornelia was the daughter of Scipio Africanus, the general who defeated Hannibal. She married Tiberius Sempronius Gracchus, bore him 12 children, and when her husband died, she was left to raise them alone. Only 3 survived to adulthood. A visiting woman once showed Cornelia her jewels, expensive glittering, imported from the edges of the known world. The woman asked to see Cornelia's jewels in return. Cornelia waited until her 2 sons, Tiberius and Gaius, walked into the room. She gestured toward them. "These," she said, "are my jewels." That story was told and retold across centuries of Roman history. Cornelia became the gold standard, the model every Roman mother was supposed to emulate. She refused a marriage proposal from King Ptolemy of Egypt, choosing to remain a univira, a one-husband woman, faithful to her dead husband's memory. The system loved her for this. Cornelia was proof that the machine worked. A woman could find fulfillment, dignity, even glory, by pouring herself entirely into her children. But the story has an ending that the Romans told with less enthusiasm. Both of Cornelia's jewels, both sons were killed. Tiberius Gracchus was beaten to death by a mob of senators in 133 BCE. His body thrown into the Tiber River. 12 years later, his brother Gaius, facing the same political enemies, ordered his own slave to kill him rather than be captured. Their bodies were denied proper burial. Their political reforms were dismantled. Cornelia outlived both of them. She spent her final years in a villa at Misenum receiving visitors who came not to comfort her, but to hear her talk about her famous father and her famous dead sons. She was praised for bearing her grief with dignity. The system's perfect woman. She did everything right, and the system killed both her sons anyway. That is not irony. That is the machine eating its own output. Turia was being raised in exactly the same mold. Spinning wool, learning silence, preparing for the day her father would hand her to a stranger. That day came when she was around 15. They could make wills. They were free from patria potestas and free from marriage. They were in the most literal sense the only free women in the Roman world. And on the morning a girl was about to lose every shred of that freedom forever, the first thing Rome did was make her look like a Vestal. They dressed her in the image of the one thing she would never be allowed to become. Why a spear? The ancient philosopher Plutarch, writing in the first century of the Common Era, offers several theories that Romans themselves debated. Some said it honored Mars, the god of war, in hopes that the marriage would produce strong warrior sons. Others claimed it was a gesture toward military victory and the strength of Rome itself. But Plutarch also recorded a darker interpretation, one that cuts closer to the truth. The spear was a deliberate callback to Rome's foundational myth, the rape of the Sabine women. According to Roman legend, in the city's earliest days, Rome had a serious problem. There were not enough women. The surrounding tribes refused to let their daughters marry Romans, seeing the new city as nothing more than a haven for criminals and outcasts. So Rome's founder, Romulus, devised a plan. He invited the neighboring Sabines to a great festival, a celebration of games and religious rites. The Sabines came, men, women, and children expecting diplomacy and entertainment. Instead, at a prearranged signal, the Roman men attacked. They did not kill the Sabine men. Not yet. Instead, they grabbed the Sabine women and girls, dragging them away by force, while their fathers, brothers, and would-be husbands were driven back with swords. The women were distributed among Roman men as wives. Not asked, not courted, taken. And according to the myth, these abducted women eventually came to love their captors, even intervening to stop a war between Rome and the Sabines when their birth families tried to rescue them. This was not Rome's dark secret. This was Rome's origin story. Their founding myth was not about freedom or justice. It was about taking women by force and calling it civilization. The historian Livy told this story with pride. It was painted on walls, carved on stone coffins, referenced in school lessons. Every Roman knew it, the way every American knows the story of the Pilgrims. And just like the Pilgrim story, nobody asked what it looked like from the other side. The spear in a bride's hair was not just a styling tool, it was a reenactment, a ritual echo of that original mass abduction renewed with every single wedding. And according to some ancient sources, the ideal spear for the ritual was one that had already killed a man in battle. A weapon literally baptized in human blood was the first thing to touch a bride on her wedding day. Think about the psychological weight of that moment. You are a young girl, and the very first ritual of your wedding, the moment that begins your transformation from maiden to wife, is performed with an instrument of death. What message does that send? What does it tell you about what is coming next? After the spear came the dress. The tunica recta, a white woolen garment woven on a special upright loom, symbolizing purity. Virginity, a product in its original packaging. Over the tunic went the flammium, a bright flame orange veil that covered the bride's face and cascaded down her shoulders. The color of fire, the color of Vesta's hearth. And around her waist, tied with deliberate, almost architectural precision, was the cingulum, a woolen belt fastened with the nodus herculaneus, the knot of Hercules. This knot was not decorative, it was symbolic of her virginity, her protected status, her body as sealed territory. The knot was deliberately difficult to untie, designed to be a puzzle, a challenge. And there was only one person in the world with the right to untie it, her husband, on their wedding night. In what would come next, the white dress. You see it at every wedding today. Queen Victoria popularized it in 1840, but the symbolism goes straight back to this room, this moment, this girl standing in the dark with a spear in her hair and a knot around her waist. White meant one thing: unopened, unused, property in original packaging. By noon, Lucia was sealed. 6 braids, a white gown, a knotted belt that only one man had the right to untie. She looked like a priestess being prepared for a sacred rite. In a sense, she was. But the god being honored was not Venus or Juno. It was the Roman state itself. And the state demanded a show. The ceremony took place at the bride's family home. A priest or an augur examined the entrails of a sacrificed animal, usually a pig or a sheep, reading the organs like a map for signs that the gods approved of this union. This was called taking the auspices, and it was serious business. If the liver was discolored, if the intestines showed an unusual pattern, the wedding could be postponed. In theory, the gods had to say yes for the contract could proceed. In practice, as the great orator Cicero noted with characteristic dryness, the auspices had a remarkable tendency to produce whatever result the families had already decided on. The gods were flexible when money was involved. With divine approval secured, the ceremony moved to its central act. The pronuba, a matron of honor who had been married only once, a univira, representing the ideal the bride was supposed to embody, took the bride's right hand and placed it in the groom's right hand. The dextrorum iunctio, the joining of right hands. Then the bride spoke the words that would dissolve her old life and begin her new one. Ubi tu Gaius ego Gaia. Where you are Gaius, I am Gaia. On the surface, it sounds like a beautiful vow of partnership. But listen to it again. Where you go, I follow. Your identity subsumes mine. Your world becomes my world. I am joining you. You are not joining me. This was not a marriage of equals. This was a surrender with witnesses. The most prestigious and most binding form of this ceremony was called confarreatio, reserved for the highest patrician families. In this version, the couple shared a cake of far and ancient grain called spelt in the presence of the Pontifex Maximus and the Flamen Dialis, Rome's highest priests. A confarreatio marriage was almost impossible to dissolve. Once sealed, the bride was locked in permanently. Her old family lost all legal claim to her. Her property, her inheritance, her very legal identity transferred completely to her husband's household. In the eyes of the law, she became the legal equivalent of her husband's daughter. Not his partner, not his equal, his dependent, his property. Which brings us to a man whose life perfectly illustrates how the machine used women as currency. Marcus Tullius Cicero, Rome's greatest orator, its most famous defender of law and justice, married his first wife Terentia for one primary reason. Her dowry was enormous. The marriage lasted 30 years. Terentia was by all accounts a formidable woman. When Cicero was exiled from Rome in 58 BC, Terentia managed the family's finances, protected their property, and navigated the dangerous political landscape with skill that most senators would have envied. She was everything the system said a wife should be. And when Cicero needed money again, when his debts piled up and his political fortunes shifted, he divorced her after 3 decades. He then married Publilia, a young woman who happened to be his own legal ward. He was her guardian. He controlled her finances. She was young enough to be his granddaughter. And the marriage was perfectly legal. No one in Rome raised an eyebrow. It was just a man managing his assets. Publilia lasted even less time. When Cicero's beloved daughter Tullia died in childbirth at 29, Publilia reportedly did not display sufficient grief. Cicero divorced her. 3 women passed through the life of Rome's greatest champion of justice. One was used for her money, one was used for her youth, and one died giving birth at an age when she should have had decades ahead of her. The system did not need villains. It just needed ordinary men following the rules. Turia's wedding would have followed these same steps. The auspices, the vow, the joined hands. But unlike Publilia, Turia would not be discarded within months. Her marriage would last over 3 decades. Whether that makes her story better or worse depends on how you define the word lucky. The contract was signed. The gods were satisfied. Now came the part Rome really looked forward to, the procession. And if you think a wedding march is about celebration, you have never seen what Rome did to its brides on the way to the groom's house. As the sun began to set, the most theatrical and psychologically brutal part of the Roman wedding began. The deductio in domum meriti, the leading of the bride to the groom's house. This was no quiet, dignified walk. This was orchestrated chaos, a deliberate spectacle of mock violence that reenacted step by step the legendary abduction of the Sabine women. First, the groom approached the bride. In front of both families, in front of witnesses, he grabbed her. This was not gentle. Ancient sources describe him seizing her, pulling her with visible strength from her mother's arms. The bride's mother was expected to play her part too. She clung to her daughter. She wept. She cried out. The groom pulled harder. The bride screamed. She struggled. She appeared to resist with everything she had. Was it all performance? Roman writers claimed it was ritualistic, that the bride's apparent reluctance was meant to appease the household gods of her birth family, to assure them she was not leaving willingly, and thus would not anger them. But here is the question that should haunt us. When does performance become reality? When does ritual fear turn into actual terror? If you are 13 years old being grabbed by a man 3 times your age while your mother screams and a crowd closes in, at what point does your brain stop distinguishing between theater and the real thing? The procession that followed was a carnival of intimidation. Torchbearers led the way, not subtle candles but massive flaming torches that turned the Roman streets into a tunnel of flickering shadows and looming walls. Flute players walked alongside their music high-pitched and otherworldly, nothing like the gentle melodies you might imagine. And surrounding the bride and groom was a crowd. Friends, family-hired celebrants, random citizens drawn by the spectacle. They sang, oh did they sing. These were called fescennine verses, obscene sexually explicit songs and chants specifically designed to be as lewd and graphic as possible. The official reason was to ward off evil spirits with vulgarity. But imagine being that bride being marched through the streets while a mob of people, some of them complete strangers, shouts increasingly explicit descriptions of what is about to happen to your body once you reach that house. The poet Catullus preserves some of these verses in his wedding poems, and even in his polished literary versions, they leave nothing to the imagination. They joked about the wedding night, about defloration, about the bride's pain and the groom's conquest. They laughed about it. This was considered entertainment. If everyone is laughing about it, it cannot be that bad, right? That is the logic. That has always been the logic. The bride was expected to smile through it all, to accept it as part of the celebration. As the procession wound through Rome's streets, other elements were added to the spectacle. Boys marched ahead of the bride, carrying her spindle and distaff, the tools of weaving symbols of her future domestic servitude displayed like a banner announcing her new job description. Someone scattered walnuts in the crowd, a fertility symbol, but also a way to draw even more people to watch, to bear witness to this transfer of ownership. The bride carried 3 coins. This detail often gets overlooked, but it matters. 1 coin was given to her husband, a symbolic purchase price buying her entry into his household. 1 was placed on the altar of the lares, the household gods of the groom's home, paying for their acceptance. And 1 was left at the nearest crossroads, an offering to the gods of the roads, the compito lares placed on the last free ground she would walk on. She had to pay to enter her own marriage. 3 coins, 1 for her husband, 1 for his gods, 1 for the road she would never walk freely again. The groomsmen standing next to the groom at a modern wedding. Originally, they were there to help fight off anyone trying to take the bride back. The best man was literally the best fighter. That tradition is still in every wedding you have ever attended. When the procession finally reached the groom's house, the doorposts were already decorated, draped with woolen ribbons, and smeared with oils or animal fat. Some sources specifically mention wolf fat drawing, yet another connection to Rome's founding myth. Romulus and Remus were supposedly raised by a she-wolf. At the threshold, the final act of the abduction drama took place. The bride was not allowed to walk over the threshold herself. This was crucial. Tripping as you entered your new home was considered an absolutely terrible omen, potentially cursing the entire marriage. So instead, the groom lifted her again, just like carrying captured property, and carried her bodily over the threshold. Today, this is one of the few Roman wedding customs that has survived completely intact, and we think of it as romantic. The groom sweeping his bride off her feet, carrying her into their new life together. Now you know. It started as a man carrying captured property into his house. Not romance. Logistics. The door shut behind them. The crowd remained outside, but the shouting continued for hours. The fescennine verses grew even cruder as wine flowed and inhibitions dropped. Inside, in the sudden relative quiet of the house, the final rituals were about to begin. The atrium, the central hall of a Roman house, dimly lit with oil lamps thick with incense, and there positioned prominently in the semi-public heart of the home was the lectus genialis, the marriage bed. Its placement was not accidental. This was not tucked away in a private bedroom. This was furniture placed where visitors, clients, and household members would regularly see it. The marriage bed was a statement, a monument to the family's legitimacy and the wife's primary purpose. It was the first thing you saw when you entered a Roman house of any standing. It said to every guest, this family is real, this marriage is consummated, this woman is doing her job. The bride was led to this bed by the pronuba, the matron of honor who had been married only once. At the bed, the husband approached. The room would likely contain a few select witnesses, perhaps close family members, perhaps trusted friends, though exactly who remained and who left at this point varies in historical accounts. What we know for certain is this: the husband reached for the knot of Hercules. This was loaded with symbolism so heavy it could break a girl's spirit just watching it happen to her. The knot represented her virginity, her protected status, her body as sealed territory that was now being opened. Hercules himself was chosen deliberately. In mythology, Hercules was not just strong, he was famously almost comically virile. Ancient sources credited him with sleeping with all 50 daughters of King Thespius in a single night. Some versions, perhaps more realistic, said 7 nights. Either way, the message was not subtle. The knot, named after the most sexually prolific hero in mythology, was about to be untied by the man who now owned this girl's body. The knot was deliberately complex. The husband had to work at it, had to struggle with it, had to pull and twist and fumble, while the bride stood there waiting. Every second of that struggle was a reminder. Every tug on the wool was a countdown. When the knot finally came undone, the bride's tunic loosened. And here we enter the part of the wedding night that history has worked very, very hard to sanitize. Modern historians, particularly Paul Vane in his groundbreaking work on Roman sexuality, have characterized what happened next with startling directness. Vane describes the expected consummation as taking the form of what he calls a legal rape. That is a modern historian's interpretation using modern terminology, not ancient Roman legal language. But Vane chose that phrase deliberately, and we need to understand why. The concept of ongoing sexual consent within marriage, the idea that a wife has the right to refuse sex with her husband, that her yes must be enthusiastic and freely given each time that marital rape is a real and prosecutable crime, this concept did not exist in Roman law. It did not exist in most legal systems until shockingly recently in human history. In Roman marriage, particularly in the traditional in manu model, a wife's body was not legally her own. Her husband had the right, even the duty, to consummate the marriage. Her role was to submit. Her feelings about this submission were legally irrelevant. This was not a secret. This was not something Romans were ashamed of. It was the entire point. The wedding night consummation served multiple functions. First, it legally confirmed the marriage. An unconsummated marriage could be annulled. The physical act was the final seal on the contract. Second, it established the husband's sexual rights over his wife's body rights that would continue for the duration of the marriage. Third, and perhaps most importantly to Romans, it opened the possibility of legitimate heirs. The entire point of Roman marriage from a legal and social perspective was to produce children, specifically legitimate male children, who could inherit property and carry on the family name. The bride's virginity was crucial because it ensured that any child she bore could be unquestionably attributed to her husband. Her value as a bride was directly tied to her unopened status, her lack of sexual history, her body as unmarked territory. And so on that bed in the atrium, surrounded by incense and shadows, with the crowd still singing outside and the household listening inside, that territory was claimed. Whether or not anyone was physically watching, everyone knew. The entire house, the entire street, the crowd still singing outside. This was not a private moment between two people. It was a legal requirement being fulfilled on schedule. For the bride, this first sexual experience would have been many things. It would almost certainly have been painful. Medical knowledge about female sexuality was primitive at best, and the idea of ensuring the bride's comfort or pleasure was not a consideration that appears anywhere in Roman writing about wedding nights. It was almost certainly frightening, especially for very young brides, who would have had only the vaguest understanding of what sex entailed, pieced together from overheard conversations, and those cruel Fescennine verses still echoing in their ears. But most of all, it was a lesson about her new status, a lesson about her new lack of autonomy, a lesson about what her body was for. And in the morning, there would be proof required, The bloodied sheets from the marriage bed might be displayed or at least examined to confirm the bride's virginity. In some periods, in some families, this was done publicly. Her body's most private moment became public evidence, a stain on fabric that determined whether the contract was valid, whether she had value, whether the transaction was complete. Turia's wedding night would have followed this same script. The same bed, the same knot, the same duty. But Turia's story does not end there. It barely begins. Because what happened over the next 30 years would test every single thing the system told her she was supposed to be. And when the test came when it really mattered, Turia did not just survive the machine. She outperformed it. And the machine's response was to try to replace her anyway. But that story requires you to understand something first. The machine we have been describing was not static. It evolved. It adapted. And when it changed, it was not because anyone suddenly cared about women like Turia. It changed because the men running it realized they could extract even more value from their daughters by keeping control instead of giving it away. Follow the money. It always comes back to the money. So here's a question. If the Manu system gave husbands total control over their wives, her property, her body, her legal identity, why would Roman men ever agree to change it? The answer is the most Roman answer possible. A different group of men wanted the money. By the late Republic, a second form of marriage had begun to overtake the older model. It was called sine manu, meaning without the hand. In this arrangement, the wife did not pass into her husband's legal power. Instead, she remained under her father's authority. And more importantly, her property, her dowry, her inheritance, it stayed in her birth family. The father kept control of the assets. Think about what this means. For centuries, marriage had been a one-way pipeline. Daughters flowed from their birth families to their husbands, and wealth flowed with them. The Manu system was great for grooms and terrible for the bride's father, who lost both his daughter and his money. Sine Manu marriage was the correction. Not a correction for the bride, a correction for the bride's father. The liberation of Roman women was not liberation at all. It was a hostile takeover by fathers who refused to let sons-in-law pocket their daughter's inheritance. But there was an unintended consequence. When a woman's father died and she had no close male relative to serve as guardian, something strange happened. She gained a degree of genuine legal independence. She could own property. She could conduct business. She could manage her own affairs. Some elite Roman women wielded enormous influence through this loophole, accumulating wealth and political connections that rivaled those of the men around them. The system cracked, not because anyone designed freedom, because greed created a loophole. But here is what did not change: the rituals. Even as the legal framework shifted beneath them, the wedding ceremonies stayed exactly the same. The spear, the mock abduction, the Fescennine verses, the threshold, the lectus genialis, the knot of Hercules. Every single theatrical element that we have described continued to be performed generation after generation, regardless of whether the marriage was in Manu or sine Manu. The law quietly updated. The theater stayed exactly the same, because the rituals were never about law. They were about reminding everyone, especially the bride, where the power actually lived. And then one man decided that even this was not enough, that marriage should not just be a family arrangement, but a weapon of the state. That bedrooms should be factories and women's bodies should be government resources. His name was Augustus. And the first woman his weapon destroyed was his own daughter. In 18 BC, Gaius Octavius, now called Augustus, now the most powerful man in the Western world, the first emperor of Rome in all but name, sat down to solve a problem. The civil wars that had consumed the previous generation had killed hundreds of thousands of Roman citizens. The army needed soldiers. The treasury needed taxpayers. The provinces needed administrators. Rome was running out of Romans. Augustus's solution was elegant, comprehensive, and devastating. He called it the Lex Julia de Maritandis Ordinibus, the Julian law on the ordering of marriages. It turned marriage from a family matter into a state mandate. Under Augustus's law, every Roman citizen of marriageable age was effectively required to be married. Unmarried men faced severe penalties. They could not fully inherit from wills. They were barred from attending public games. They were socially stigmatized by imperial policy. Married couples who failed to produce children faced similar restrictions. But women who bore 3 or more children, they received a reward. The ius trium liberorum, the right of 3 children. For the first time in Roman history, a woman could earn legal freedom, genuine independence from male guardianship, the right to manage her own property and affairs. The price was 3 children. Her body was literally the currency. Augustus did not stop there. He also passed the Lex Julia de Adulterius, a law criminalizing adultery with unprecedented severity. If a married woman committed adultery, it was a public crime. Her husband was legally required to divorce her. If he failed to do so, if he chose to forgive her, he himself could be prosecuted for harboring an adulteress. The woman's father had the legal right to kill her and her lover if he caught them in the act in his own home. Exile, confiscation of property, and permanent social disgrace were the minimum punishments. But if a married man slept with a prostitute, an unmarried woman, or a slave, that was not adultery. That was not even a crime. The law protected the sexual integrity of married women as property of their husbands. It had no interest in the sexual behavior of men. Augustus built this machine with the confidence of a man who believed he was above it. He was wrong. The machine he created would grind up the person he loved most in the world. Her name was Julia. She was Augustus's only biological child, and from the day she was born, she was not a daughter. She was a chess piece. Augustus used her to build alliances with the men he needed, marrying her off 3 times over the course of her short life, each time to serve a different political purpose. The first husband was Marcellus, the son of Augustus's sister Octavia. Julia was about 14 years old. Marcellus was young, promising, and being groomed as Augustus's heir. The marriage was a political signal, a dynastic announcement. But Marcellus died 2 years later, possibly of disease, possibly of poison. Rome whispered about it for decades. Julia was a widow at 16. The second husband was Marcus Agrippa, Augustus's most trusted general and closest friend. Agrippa was everything Marcellus was not. Battle-hardened, politically shrewd, and approximately 25 years older than Julia. Augustus did not ask Julia's opinion. Agrippa was the man Augustus needed, so Agrippa was the man Julia married. Over 9 years, Julia bore Agrippa 5 children. 5 pregnancies in 9 years. Her body was a production line for the dynasty. Then Agrippa died in 12 BC CE, and Julia was a widow again at 27, with 5 children and 2 dead husbands. The third husband was Tiberius, the son of Augustus's wife Livia from a previous marriage. This was the worst match of all, and everyone knew it. Tiberius was in love with someone else, his first wife Vipsania, whom Augustus had forced him to divorce specifically so he could marry Julia. Tiberius reportedly saw Vipsania by chance after the divorce and burst into tears on the spot. Arrangements were made to ensure they never crossed paths again. Julia and Tiberius despised each other. Tiberius eventually abandoned Rome entirely and retreated to the island of Rhodes, leaving Julia alone in the imperial capital. And Julia, trapped in a loveless marriage to a man who could not stand to be in the same city as her, did the one thing the system could not forgive. She found pleasure on her own terms. She took lovers, multiple lovers, openly, recklessly, almost as if she wanted to be caught. And here is where Augustus's machine turned on its maker. The Lex Julia de Adulterius, the law Augustus himself had written, required him to act. If a married woman committed adultery, her father was legally obligated to pursue charges. Augustus could not look the other way. He could not quietly arrange a divorce. He had written the law, and the law demanded enforcement. To ignore Julia's behavior would have been to undermine the entire legal framework he had built his moral reform on. In 2 BCE, Augustus denounced his own daughter before the Roman Senate. He declared her an adulteress. He listed her lovers. He described her behavior in terms so graphic that even the senators were uncomfortable. Then he exiled her to the tiny island of Pandateria, a barren rock in the Tyrrhenian Sea. No wine was permitted. No male visitor could approach the island without Augustus's personal, written authorization. No luxury of any kind. Augustus reportedly said of Julian that she was a disease in his flesh. He never saw her again. Julia spent the rest of her life in exile. When Augustus died in 14 Tiberius, now emperor, the man who had despised Julia for decades cut off her remaining support. Ancient sources say she died of malnutrition shortly after. Whether she starved or simply gave up is a question historians still debate. She was about 52 years old. Augustus built the most powerful marriage machine in history. He turned weddings into state policy bedrooms, into factories, and women's bodies into government resources. And the machine he built ground his own daughter to dust. He died knowing that. Whether it kept him up at night, history does not record, but I would like to think it did. Tax breaks for married couples, government incentives for having children, fertility programs funded by the state. The language is different. The machinery is familiar. And now we come to Turia, the woman who outlasted the machine, the woman whose story survives not because she was powerful or famous, but because her husband loved her and felt guilty and needed to carve his feelings into stone. The Laudatio Turiae, the praise of Turia. It is the longest surviving eulogy from the Roman world, a massive inscription that was originally displayed publicly, probably near the family tomb. The text is damaged fragments have been lost over the centuries, but enough remains to reconstruct one of the most extraordinary personal stories to survive from the ancient world. It was written by her husband, whose name is disputed, but may have been Quintus Lucretius Vespillo, sometime between 8 and 2 BCE. And what he wrote is not just a eulogy, it is a confession. The early years of Turia's marriage followed the script exactly. She was faithful, obedient, industrious. She managed the household. She spun wool. She honored the gods. Her husband describes her as embodying every virtue the system demanded. She was, in his words, the model of what a Roman wife should be. If the story ended there, it would be unremarkable. Thousands of Roman women lived exactly this life and disappeared without a trace. But history does not remember the obedient. History remembers the extraordinary. And Turia's extraordinary moment came when the Republic itself collapsed. In 43 BCE, the Second Triumvirate, the alliance of Octavian, Mark Antony, and Lepidus, seized power and immediately began eliminating political enemies through a process called prescription. Lists of names were published. Any Roman citizen on the list was declared an outlaw. Their property was confiscated. Any person could kill a prescribed man and claim a reward. Turia's husband was on the list. What happened next is recorded in her husband's own words, and even through the formal language of a Roman eulogy, the fear and admiration are palpable. Turia hid her husband. The sources suggest she concealed him in a space above the ceiling of their bedroom, a crawl space barely large enough for a man to lie flat. She fed him. She brought him information about the political situation outside. She managed everything while soldiers searched the city for him. When soldiers came to the house looking for her husband, Turia faced them directly. She told them he was not there. She was not believed. She was grabbed. She was dragged. According to the eulogy, she was beaten, her body covered in bruises. She did not break. She did not reveal his location. She endured the violence and said nothing. But Turia did not stop at passive resistance. She took her own jewelry and gold assets she had brought into the marriage as part of her dowry and smuggled them to her husband so he could survive in hiding and eventually attempt to flee. She stripped herself of her personal wealth to keep him alive. Then she went further. She traveled to Lepidus, himself one of the 3 most powerful men in the world, and personally petitioned for her husband's pardon. Let me be clear about what happened here. A woman trained from birth to spin wool and stay silent walked into the office of one of the 3 most powerful men in the world and demanded her husband's life. She was not polite about it. She was not meek. The eulogy describes her as being physically assaulted by Lepidus's bodyguards. She was grabbed, thrown to the ground, beaten so badly she was covered in bruises. Lepidus himself was present and did nothing to stop it. But Turia was not deterred. She went back. She petitioned again. She kept going until Octavian, the future Augustus, eventually granted her husband clemency. She saved his life. Through courage that most Roman men could not have matched, through a willingness to endure violence and humiliation that went beyond anything the system had trained her for, she pulled her husband out of the grave that Roman politics had dug for him. And now comes the part of the story that has haunted me since the first time I read it. The civil wars ended. Octavian consolidated power. Turia's husband was restored to his position. Their property was returned. Life resumed its normal rhythm. They should have lived out their days in gratitude and peace. But there was a problem. After more than 30 years of marriage, Turia had not produced a child. In Roman society, this was not just a disappointment. It was a fundamental failure of the marriage's purpose. The entire legal, social, and religious framework of Roman marriage existed to produce legitimate heirs. A marriage without children was, in the eyes of the system, a marriage that had not fulfilled its function. So Turia's husband, this man whose life she had saved, this man for whom she had been beaten and humiliated, this man who freely admitted in his own words that she was the best wife any man could hope for, he came to her with a proposal. He suggested that they should divorce so that he could marry another woman who could give him children. He told Turia that she could choose the replacement herself if she wanted. He said she could remain in the household treated with respect as a kind of sister figure. He assured her that his affection would not change. He presented this proposal as if it were the most reasonable thing in the world, as if he were offering her a kindness by not simply throwing her out, which was entirely within his legal rights. He framed it as a painful sacrifice for both of them, a practical necessity demanded by duty and tradition. He was not cruel. That is the worst part. He was not a villain twisting his mustache and casting aside a loyal wife. He genuinely loved her. You can feel it in every line of the eulogy. He admired her. He was grateful to her. He knew in some part of himself that the Roman system never gave him the vocabulary to express that what he was proposing was monstrous. But the system had taught him that a wife who could not produce heirs had failed at her only real job. Love was not enough. 30 years was not enough. Saving his life was not enough. Turia's reaction is recorded in the eulogy, and even through her husband's careful formal language, you can feel the devastation. She wept. She protested. She begged him not to go through with it. She said she would rather die than see another woman take her place. She refused to leave. And in this moment, Turia did something that the entire Roman system, 1,000 years of tradition and law and ritual, had never been designed to handle. She said no. Not quietly, not meekly, not with the practiced submission of a Roman wife accepting her fate. She said no with the same ferocity that had carried her into Lepidus's office, the same stubbornness that had kept her standing when soldiers knocked her down. And her husband relented. He abandoned the idea. They remained married until Turia died. In the eulogy, he credits her devotion, expresses his guilt for ever having suggested it, and praises her as the finest wife in Roman history. He carved her story in stone, every word dripping with love and guilt and pride. And he never once questioned the system that almost made him throw away the best thing in his life, because the system was invisible to him. It was just how things worked. It was just the way it had always been. The machine did not die with the Roman Republic. It did not die with the empire. It just changed its clothes. When Christianity became the dominant religion of the Roman world in the 4th century of the Common Era, the old pagan wedding rituals began to shift. The spear disappeared. The Fescennine verses were silenced. The mock abduction was no longer performed. The wolf fat was scrubbed from the doorposts. On the surface, it looked like everything had changed. But look closer at what survived. A father still walks his daughter down the aisle and hands her to another man. A woman still wears white on her wedding day, advertising her purity. A husband still carries his bride over the threshold. The bride still stands on the groom's left because, in the old tradition, the groom needed his right hand free to draw his sword against anyone who might try to steal her back. The ring still goes on the 4th finger of the left hand because the Romans believed a vein ran directly from that finger to the heart, the vena amoris, the vein of love. That is Roman, every bit of it. The church fathers built a new framework, but they poured it on the same foundation. St. Paul wrote in his letter to the Ephesians, "Wives, submit to your husbands as to the Lord." Augustine declared that sex within marriage was acceptable only when the purpose was procreation. A wife who refused her husband's sexual demands was guilty of sin. The medieval bedding ceremony stripped the metaphor away entirely. Wedding guests physically escorted the couple to their chamber. In some traditions, they remained to witness the consummation. In others, they waited outside while the couple performed their duty, and in the morning they inspected the sheets. The Roman atrium became the medieval bedchamber. The spear became a Bible. The Fescennine verses became bawdy toasts. The machine did not die. It just got baptized. And it kept running for centuries. Through the Renaissance, through the Enlightenment, through revolutions that proclaimed liberty and equality and brotherhood, but somehow never quite got around to including women. Marital rape was not criminalized in all 50 U.S. states until 1993. Let that settle, 1993. Within the lifetime of every person listening to this, the legal principle that Augustus would have recognized that a husband has sexual rights to his wife's body, that her consent within marriage is irrelevant, that principle was still enforceable in American courtrooms less than 35 years ago. Now we have come full circle, back to the morning after, back to the girl. Lucia sits in her husband's house. It is her first morning as a wife. She is wearing a stola for the first time, the long layered garment that marks a married woman. She will never again wear the clothing of a maiden. She begins to spin wool. It is the first task she performs as a wife, and it will be among the last. This same motion, this same thread pulled from the same kind of wool, repeated across tens of thousands of mornings in tens of thousands of Roman houses, by tens of thousands of women who have no choice in the matter. Somewhere in a different house in a different year, Turia is spinning the same thread. Turia who faced down soldiers. Turia who walked into the most dangerous room in Rome and demanded her husband's life. Turia who was beaten and went back. Turia who said no when the system told her she had no right to. Even Turia is spinning wool this morning, because that is what wives do. That is what they have always done. That is the machine. Turia never got a statue. She never got a temple. She got a slab of stone with her husband's words on it, words that survived 2,000 years because someone built them to last. And in those words, buried under all the Roman virtue and duty and pride, is something that sounds almost modern, almost like love, but filtered through a machine that did not have a word for equality, did not have a concept of consent, and measured a woman's worth by what came out of her body. The spear that parted a bride's hair on her wedding morning was not just a weapon, it was a mission statement. It said, this is what we are. This is how we build families. This is how we build civilization. Through conquest, through control, through the quiet daily subjugation of half the population performed so openly that no one even recognized it as subjugation. They called it tradition. They called it duty. They called it sacred. The next time you are at a wedding, your daughters, your granddaughters, your neighbors watch. Watch who walks the bride down the aisle. Watch who gives her away. Watch the white dress. Watch the threshold. Watch the ring slide onto the fourth finger of her left hand. And ask yourself how much of this is love and how much of this is a machine that has been running so long we forgot it was ever built. Rome did not bury this history. We did. Because the machine works best when no one can see it running. If you wanted to know about the only women in Rome who escaped this system entirely, the Vestal Virgins, and what Rome did to them when they broke the rules, that story is coming next week. You are not ready.